And we're told that as you go further down in the rocks, you find these simple animals, and as you come up near the top, they get more complex, and then the modern animals near the top, which shows an evolutionary progression. And the record of the rocks has recorded, like a tape recorder, the evolution of life through time. That's their interpretation of what we're seeing. The biggest problem with this representation is rather obvious, and that is that you can't go out and look in the rocks and find it anywhere. It exists in the textbooks, but it does not exist anywhere on the face of the earth. That is, in the complete form that you see in the textbooks. Now, if that sounds like a rather brash statement, notice the quote from Leet and Judson, one of the typical textbooks used as a geology text in our universities. Because we cannot find sedimentary rock representing all of Earth time neatly in one convenient area, we must piece together the rock sequence from locality to locality. This process of tying one rock sequence in one place to another in some other place is known as correlation. And so instead of digging down and finding it in any one place, you find some over here and find some over there, and you tie it together and correlate the layers, not based on what you see in any one place. As the Encyclopedia Britannica says, the end product of correlation is a mental abstraction called the geologic column. Now, you don't get that impression in the undergraduate earth science textbooks. That's a shame. But this is not concrete, if you please. It is a mental abstraction that is built together. Well, how do you build it? How do you know when you correlate whether this rock goes down or up? Well, if you're an evolutionist and you have rocks with simple animals, where do they go? They go on the bottom. I'm somewhat oversimplifying, but that's a general picture of what's happening. R.H. Rastell in the Encyclopedia Britannica puts it this way: it cannot be denied that geologists are here arguing in a circle. The succession of organisms has been determined by a study of their remains embedded in the rocks, and the relative ages of the rocks are determined by the organisms they contain. Now, let me illustrate and simplify, somewhat oversimplifying, but still not misrepresenting. A person says, we have a primitive fossil here. Okay, how do you know? And of course, that would go on the bottom of the column. But how do you know that's a primitive fossil? Well, it's found in an old rock. All right, that would make sense. If you've got an old rock, it'd be a primitive fossil. But now, how do you know that this is an old rock? Well, it's got a primitive fossil in it. And this is obviously not proving anything. But that is how this column in its complete form is built. You don't determine the kind of rock it is by the kind of rock it is, but by the critters that you find in it, the dead things in the rock, and how primitive you think they are.
Oh, and this is happening all the time because our vision is so small. So the geologists have always had a tendency to work within a basinal area, and they know that area. But this is a great example. When we were in Wyoming, that was the Lance Formation. Well, it's called that in Wyoming, but that's the same formation as the Hell Creek Formation up in Montana. Yeah. Totally different names, exactly the same formation. And so the geologists often have local names and correlation, and Maul points this out in his book as well. I keep bringing him up to point, he is not a flood geologist. He is a secular geologist that rejects the flood and yet points to these same issues, that there is correlation is one of the great challenges because we're all so small. Getting a size of just how big this stuff is hard for the individual, especially when it's covered with grass or covered with trees, and you've got to match outcroppings from this place to this place to this place.
By viewer request, we're devoting this entire show to the subject of OOPArts. What on earth is an OOPArt? An OOPArt is an acronym for out-of-place artifact. A fossil or archaeological item is found in the wrong place, or someplace where it was not expected. For example, opening a new chamber in the Egyptian pyramids and finding an airplane, or finding a man-made artifact in rocks 1 billion years old, or fossil evidence of man in those rocks. The artifact is out of place. But what does that mean, out of place? How is it out of place? If you find a fossil in a rock, then the fossil is simply in the rock. How is it out of place? Well, there is only one answer to that, and that is that the fossil or artifact is in the wrong place according to the evolutionary theory and timescale.
That led us then to talking about really a very interesting area, soft tissue in dinosaur bones, which is with Kevin Anderson, and we went down to Arizona for that. Which that was an exciting area for you. I know you were this is one of the more fascinating areas, I think, for most people. They're fascinated. They're not unaware of this.
No, I mean, the opportunity to go into the lab with Dr. Kevin Anderson, but his explanation of how that material, the protein in that material, breaks down rapidly. It's not something that survives a long period of time. And in particular, as he was saying, in the hostile environment in which these things are found, and the fact that we're now finding it in other bones. That's a paradigm shift for people who would have never, ever have considered finding soft dinosaur tissue. And so we weren't looking for it.
Right.
And now that we're looking for it, well, we're finding this is not an anomaly. This is not a one-off. They even find it in rib bones, smaller rib bones.
That's right.
Even more impossible is the apparent DNA still found in these tissues. DNA decays far, far faster than the soft tissues themselves. Another compound that decays in an absolute maximum of 100,000 years is carbon-14. Yet large quantities of carbon-14 have been found in dinosaur bones, wood fragments from the dinosaur-bearing layers, etc. All of this shows that even the dead dinosaurs have only been dead within the time of mankind.
Then what no one seemed to talk about is radiation. That the levels of uranium and thorium in the soil, I think there's a scientist that talks about this. You can put, apparently, I've done this, a Geiger counter up against many fossils bones, and it lights up. Meaning, and let's just take the paradigm, it really is 65 million years old, well, the amount of uranium and thorium and all the things that we know, we often have people getting radon, just checking in our own homes, so we don't want the levels. That's all in there. So basically, the idea of gamma rays and beta waves that will be going through and destroying this tissue for 65, 75 million years, that's really extraordinary.
Right.
And no one has explained how, what is it, lead encased now too? And what is this? And then you have the reality of how they're found, and there's so much of them.
Canadian creationist Vance Nelson is at it again, as he is just putting the finishing touches on his latest book in the Untold Secrets of Planet Earth series. He posted the rather provocative tweet with a photo of fossilized wood from dinosaur deposits and saying, supposedly 65 million years old, but not fossilized and contains carbon-14. The idea of millions of years is faith. He'll be detailing the research in his latest book, Flood Fossils. This was another in many cases we have seen of a fossil tree buried in the same layer as dinosaurs, with 4 different states of preservation in the tree. Part of it was petrified, part was coalified, part was peat, and part was wood. Nelson sent samples to a lab, and lo and behold, there was loads of carbon-14 in the wood. Well, anything older than an absolute maximum age of 100,000 years old should have 0 carbon-14 in it. Instead, these dinosaur-era logs had lots of carbon-14 in them. Again, just like the dinosaur bones themselves. All of this just stacks up to the overwhelming evidence that the Earth is young, not billions of years old, but thousands, and that's why there is still so much carbon-14 found in the fossil record.
It doesn't fit, and so forth, so it doesn't get reported. And so it's not out of meanousness, it's just that it's something weird, and so and so now we go back and say, well, my goodness, now there's radiocarbon in here, which shouldn't be there. Especially if you're talking about millions, 60, 70, 80 millions of years. By that, radiocarbon has such a small half-life. It should be gone, but it isn't. And so now we have soft dinosaur tissue, we have radiocarbon in there, which is saying that these may not be as old as what we've been told. And so all of a sudden, these are one of those anomalies. This is the anomalies piling up.
Correct. One after the other.
That begin to shake a paradigm.
And I want to look at footprints in the rocks. Follow the footprints. See where they lead us to. We're going to look at bird tracks. We're going to look at tetrapod tracks. Tetrapod basically means 4 legs. Scientists like using long, complicated words to confuse people. Well, no, actually, that's not the reason. It's because it's actually precise, but it makes it difficult to follow some of the arguments sometimes. So we use these terms because it means something very precise. But let's try and simplify it. Let's try and understand what's going on. We're also going to look at fossil human footprints, I would suggest to you. So let's start off with some bird-like footprints. Back in 2002, there was an article in Nature based on some footprints found in the Santo Domingo Formation in Argentina. And here's the pictures of them. Look at those footprints. What do you think? What do you see? Well, I see bird footprints. They've got 4 toes like birds, and they are like perching birds. In fact, there's one backward-facing toe, which is a feature that's almost unique to birds. So people looked at these, the authors of this paper looked at these and said, these look like birds' footprints, but they can't be bird footprints because we know birds did not exist back then because this is Triassic rock. It's too old for birds. Birds did not exist, they say. Well, actually, I'm a creationist. I'm not so hung up on fixing it like that. I have no problem with birds wandering around in the Triassic, whenever the Triassic was. And then these were re-examined later. They went back to look at this again in 2009 and did some more study, and they compared these tracks with what you actually get today with birds wandering around on the seashore. And they recognized traces of flight, probing marks like seabirds poking in the sand, and tracks similar to modern shorebirds. And they basically said, well, this strongly suggests that birds made the fossil tracks. They're now to have a problem. Well, we're going to have to fix this problem because we know there's no birds in the Triassic. That's what the evolutionists will tell you. Well, so they say, actually, the solution to this is probably the rocks are younger than we thought first of all. So hang on a minute. Whoa, you're always telling me these radiometric dating methods are accurate. And now you're telling me, well, we're going to have to make these rocks younger because we've got birds wandering around on them when they shouldn't be there. Well, if you're a creationist, that's not a problem. If you're an evolutionist, it is a problem. You can look this up in a snappily titled journal called Paleogeography, Paleoclimatology and Paleoecology back in 2009, and it's all there. And they acknowledge that these look like bird footprints. Now we have a problem. Something's wrong here. It doesn't fit the evolutionary story. And this happens over and over again. The problem with this talk that I've had is which evidence do I leave out? Because there's so much which doesn't fit evolution, which points to creation.
So that session that we had with Andrew Snelling was an important one, but it was also a difficult one. It could have been the most difficult one we did because it's hard for us in a very short period of time to help people understand just how tenuous the radiometric dating process is and all the different assumptions that are made in order for one to get from the observation of a current sample with a current amount of the parent element and a current amount of the daughter element, and from that extrapolate backwards into some time in which you can say this was when this element really came into being. And there's so many different assumptions associated with that. And again, also the evidence that Dr. Snelling is bringing forth is we think we have evidence of a period in which that radioactive decay was actually accelerated. I don't know how well people understood that, but hopefully they got from that the overview understanding that the radiometric dating is critical to the deep time perspective, and yet it sits on some very, very shaky ground, a whole lot of assumptions.
Well, and I think that's fair to say, and I think that even Andrew would have said that there's so much we don't know about this, and I think that the idea is that when you say that it's really not a clock, it's really you're just measuring decay rates, and you're making these assumptions it's a clock. And I think that the issues in terms of heat, let's talk about this. Is one of the interesting things. There are many things these guys say they don't understand and know. And I think that's what science is. I think Andrew said at the end, it's a culture of skepticism. But I feel like that's the key is the assumptions of saying, yes, this idea of geochronology, how do we use the rocks and then these radioactive, it's igneous rocks because you can't do it with sedimentary rocks, these igneous layers that are in between these to get this. I know, having read some of the books of graduate level stuff of chronostratigraphy, this is not a simple deal, and there are a lot of debates, even in the groups within, of, okay, what's this and how does that work? And there's a sense of we've got to keep this all together. Maul points this out in his book, giving some of the history of this, that this is not a done deal, but no one ever sees this. But I think that the idea of saying that there are real radioactive atoms that are really decaying, and there do appear to be decay rates that seem constant today, the problem we get into is that people also thought time was constant for a really long time, until Einstein. And so the idea that you could tell a Newton that, oh, well, you know, time, the faster you go toward the speed of light, time might slow down. They'd think you were an idiot. They'd say it violates everything we know about the world. You can't be right. And so many of the same things that are thrown against these guys, that, well, heat problems and, you know, issues of decay that don't seem a certain way, and they are constantly throwing criticisms out. That's what they would have all said to Einstein. In fact, Einstein was rejected in many of his views until, of course, some of the experiments that were done in the early 20th century. In fact, it really wasn't until many, many years that it was really kind of clarified, and many people would point out that even today there are things that are very hard to understand about the general theory as well, and there are people that question some of Einstein's ideas. Meaning,
Right.
But you go back in time 200 years and they would have thought Einstein's ideas were totally idiotic and it was impossible. So I just feel that this area, and we ended up, like you said, having to pull out a lot of the science, because I ran it by a very smart guy, a whole section of it, and he said, I don't understand what he's saying. And so you've got to listen to him for an hour, I think, to understand him. And so the idea of putting it into 5 minutes was impossible, so we just kind of had to cut to the chase.
Right.
But I do think that his work on radio halos, on helium, I mean, it's very fascinating. You can look in their book, the rate book, the chart of all of these datings, and they publish it. You look at the radiocarbon stuff with coal. You look at what's been found in dinosaur bones. The anomaly structure, and that's what Kuhn tells us, the buildup of anomalies, one after the other, that do not fit within the paradigm are usually what people say, ignore, we got to talk away, we got to explain it away. It's always the consistent view that the anomalies continue to build. And I think that's the bottom line we wanted to show here, is this was an examination of anomalies.
Right. And those anomalies build until they cause that current paradigm to collapse.
Correct.
And that's why I personally think that the current scientific paradigm is temporary, and it's possible it could collapse within our lifetime, because the anomalies that are growing, they're growing against the Big Bang. I think they're growing against Einstein, and for sure they're growing against neo-Darwinianism.
Well, I just think that the issues we're dealing with you have to have an open hand with scientific views. You have to have a certain humility, and that the views that were laughed at in the past. So in the same year that Darwin came out with The Origin of Species, you know, Antonio Snyder Pellegrini came up with this idea that, well, let's look at these continents. They seem like they kind of fit together. And maybe the plates move around. He was a flood geologist, and they all said, "What a joke! You're a fool."
Yeah.
And so he's ignored. And then you had Alfred Wegener, the German, who said, "No, I think there's really something here." And, "Oh, you're a fool! You're a fool." Post World War II, the submarine data comes out, and lo and behold, there are all these mountain chains in the middle of the ocean.
Right.
And every geologist alive that's older today talks about the paradigm shift that happened within within a handful of a decade. No possibility of plate tectonics to everybody believes in plate tectonics. And I think that so it gets very dangerous for people to say that this deductive scientific model we know is true, and you guys are all fools for thinking it. I seem to hear an echo in the room whenever I hear that. And I think that's what I felt we needed to do, is show that these men had done some really good work in identifying anomalies. They may not all be accurate in everything they think about these anomaly structure. What they know is that the history in Genesis is true, and that these anomaly structures would fit within that history.
Some rocks in Poland which have footprints in them of a four-legged creature wandering around. And on the evolutionary timescale, I say I'll use it for convenience, these are 400 million years old. They are too old. So before Tiktaalik and Panderichthys, and before Ichthyostega and Acanthostega and other four-legged creatures, there are these footprints too early in the fossil record, creating problems for the evolutionists. 4 feet in the Devonian, too early. 18 million years before the earliest known tetrapod fossil. So basically, there's something walking around 18 million years before there's something to walk around and make the footprints. How does that work? Well, there must be something making the footprints. But it wasn't Acanthostega, because there are no fossils of that creature at that time. Or if it was, it could have been. And if it is, then the whole evolutionary story falls apart. This forces us to infer what they call ghost lineages for tetrapods. In other words, we haven't got the fossils, but we assume they're there. That's what they mean by a ghost lineage. It's not there, it's a ghost. And until now, they said, the replacement of these fish by tetrapods has appeared to reflect an evolutionary event, until now. And this is evolutionists admitting that their story is wrong. And what they put in its place? Well, at the moment, we have nothing. They have nothing. So basically, these footprints have stomped all over the evolutionary story of how fish evolved into creatures with 4 legs. So the tetrapods and the lobe-finned fishes, they say, coexisted for at least 10 million years. It doesn't fit their sequence. And the sequence I'm happy with. There's long periods of time I'm not. But when you look at the evidence on their terms, it falls over. It fails. And this is published in Nature in 2010. So let's have a look at human footprints, human tracks. Well, I would suggest to you that the most famous fossil footprints for humans are found in Laetoli. And here's a picture of them. What you see is you see toes in line, like a human being. You see a foot arch, like a human foot. You see a human stride. You see the heel down first and the weight transferred to the ball of the foot. You see pushing off the toes. Basically, whoever made these footprints walked just like a human being does, just like you do. And they've tested this out by making people walk barefoot across sand and comparing all the footprints. The creatures that made this had a foot that was just like your foot and my foot. But we know, says the evolutionist, that humans were not around then because these are 3 million years old. And humans didn't exist then, so humans can't possibly have made these footprints. It must have been Australopithecus, which is Lucy, and her, or he's not even sure that she was a lady actually, but Lucy and her brothers and sisters must have made these footprints. Therefore, they must have a foot like a human. It's kind of a little vague, a little circular. They're not very certain. But they can't accept that because they know humans didn't exist back then 3 million years ago. Well, I'm sorry, I'm a creationist. I have no problem with humans walking around in rocks that apparently seem to be 3 million years old.
But I think that he brings up so many interesting points, this issue of trackways. So I went, in the way that I often research this is I would go to the secular literature and say, well, what are they saying on this? So this is very interesting. You look at these trackways, I found all those dates out of the secular literature. This was not creationist works. These are the idea of the trilobites, the Cruziana, and the 10 million years to the first trilobites in the Cambrian. That's in there. The issue of these amphibians, that's been found in Poland. So those 35 million years and the 10 million, this is all based, and I mean, it's just out there in the literature. Most people don't know this, but he said this is over and over and over again, not just those 3. There are many, many instances where the trackways come before, and if you're going to take that there's millions of years before the fossils. Well, this is extraordinary. I mean, this is, again, it strains the credibility of how this would actually happen.
And remember, this didn't make the film, but we were with him up in Deadwood.
In Deadwood, that's right, in South Dakota. And we actually saw the Cruziana, those
and we looked at those
layers
little
of
trackways of the trilobites.
You can see them. You can see where the rock's falling off. It's very flat.
Right.
And
there are lots of those little trackways, but there are no trilobite fossils in there.
Nope. No.
And that's what he was explaining. He said we see these are the layers where we see all of their trackways. We don't get to see the trilobites till we get to the layer above, or maybe 2 layers above.
Yeah, and it's curious. And it would make sense that you would at some point find trilobites in these layers. Now, they haven't yet, but it would actually make sense for them to do that. And the expectation is that there will be even some, the flood model provides a lot of explanations for additional anomalies that will be found. That you're going to find these anomaly structures that are out there. And I think that gets into the question then of these layering and putting the fossils into layers, which is that ecosystem, the sorting of the ecosystem or ecosystem of the different flora and fauna mixtures from the Cambrian and moving forward. That these are not periods of time, but are different ecosystems. And it's a very robust model because when you look at the Cambrian, it just appears. And I went and checked out the library, one of the best books on the Cambrian explosion right now. It's a secular book. But I think they get to about chapter 11, and they're trying to explain this well, why don't you have anything below? And the title of the chapter is talking about ghosts. Well, there must be ghosts down there because we know there need to be other animals, but we don't find them, so the ghosts must be there. And so I thought, now this is fascinating. This is a very graduate level scholarly work, and they're talking about ghosts. And they say that, well, you creationists are making stuff up. I think that there's a reasonable point when you start looking at the data and saying, this really has problems. You know, the Cambrian, and you go look at the Burgess Shale, and we included, you can go online and see these images of these really, really complex sea creatures. They just appear. And I think that it's a problem, unless you're going to have a view that, well, this just all was picked up during the flood. And it goes up and up and up and up.
One of the exciting bits of information that's coming out now, one of the students here, Tom Stidham, has been going through our collections from the late Cretaceous, looking for the remains of birds. And what they're finding is that there is at that time, in the late Cretaceous, quite a diversity of modern groups of birds. Tom has just had a little article published in Nature in which he describes a late Cretaceous parrot. There are more pieces of information out there that are now being described in papers that are being written or in review, showing that other kinds of modern birds were present in the late Cretaceous.
But wait, is this completely modern bird found flying over the heads of dinosaurs an unusual occurrence? Nope, not even close. When Dr. Carl Werner was conducting his research for his book and DVD, Living Fossils, he visited 60 natural history museums and 10 different dinosaur dig sites around the world. In asking the paleontologists, consistently they reported finding not just fossil birds, but modern fossil birds among the dinosaurs. Parrots, owls, albatross, loons, ducks, cormorants, penguins, sandpipers, the classic flamingo. Yet mysteriously, only one of the museums depicted a bird found with the dinosaurs. And they only depicted one bird off in an out-of-the-way corner. But it gets better. We find fossils before the dinosaurs in the evolutionary time scale. Proto-Avis is identical to the modern-day blackbird, but yet it is deemed controversial. I would suggest the only reason it's controversial is because it was found in rocks dated 225 million evolutionary years old. Rocks in which I've personally excavated, the Texas Triassics. In 2007, I first examined a trail of strange fossil footprints which had been discovered in the 1960s. Now, when I first read about the trail in 2002, the museum in Nova Scotia had mentioned the trail was probably made by a crocodile-like creature named Baropesia. Now, when I first saw the trail for myself in 2007, my first surprise was seeing that the trail was obviously made by a bipedal or two-legged animal. The museum in Nova Scotia's website now contains a graphic depicting Baropesia being buoyed up by water and thus only walking on its two back legs. Obviously, they agree that it was only two legs making the trail, and I agree that the creature was being buoyed up and influenced by water as it made the trail, but I disagree that it was Baropesia. Baropesia make very distinct tracks which do not even vaguely resemble the Horton Bluff tracks, neither in size nor shape. Baropesia tracks are typically about 2.5 centimeters across, while the Horton Bluff tracks are a very strange U-shaped track about 25 centimeters across. So what creature made the trail of fossil footprints then? With a little help from my friends in Alberta, I think we found the culprit. And yes, he even looks guilty. Clinton and Diane at the Del Alta Ostrich Ranch, not far out of Calgary, Alberta, aided in the study by letting me hose down their yard and having one of their ostriches walk through the mud. The ostriches have a unique U-shaped foot. And because of the way the ostrich walks, when it walks through deep mud and the foot rotates, the track exaggerates the length of the smaller toe, and it makes a dead ringer match to the Horton Bluff tracks. So who cares? Why does it matter whether or not an ostrich made the Horton Bluff tracks? Well, because those tracks are found in rocks dated by the evolutionary timescale as some 350 million years old. To have completely modern birds in such old rock completely nullifies the wild speculation of dinosaurs evolving into birds, because according to the evolution myth, dinosaurs had not yet evolved by that time. But the thing is, this is also old news. A trail of fossil footprints was found on the same beach in the 1800s by famous geologist William Logan. The tracks are very clearly identical to those of modern wading birds. Now, in his paper to the Geological Society of America in 1933, C.M. Sternberg wrote of the tracks saying, "Superficially, they resemble the tracks of some of the wading birds, but of course there is little probability of their having been made by birds." Notice what just happened. When Sternberg wrote this, evolutionism had taken hold in the scientific community. The obvious interpretation of the evidence was rejected out of hand in favor of evolution, because evolutionism is assumed to be correct. Now, why would this happen? Notice that attempts to identify the track maker of the Horton Bluff footprints has led to bizarre suggestions like Baropesia and even fish flippers. Neither of these even come close to explaining the trackways. Why was the ostrich never considered? Well, the reasons have nothing to do with science. Otherwise, the simplest, most obvious scientific explanation would be embraced. Birds identical to modern birds made fossil footprints at Blue Beach. But the rejection of the obvious conclusions is not because of science, but rather because of human nature. This rejection of the evidence and the complete embrace of the long refuted evolutionism myth has to do with our origins and the fear and or hatred of a personal creator God. Of course, any out-of-order finds would falsify evolution, as Dr. Stephen M. Stanley pointed out. There is an infinite variety of ways in which, since 1859, the general concept of evolution might have been demolished. Consider the fossil record, a little-known resource in Darwin's day. The unequivocal discovery of a fossil population of horses in Precambrian rocks would disprove evolution. More generally, any topsy-turvy sequence of fossils would force us to rethink our theory, yet not a single one has come to light. Correction, dozens, perhaps hundreds of examples have been found and systematically ignored. Any topsy-turvy sequence of fossils would be a problem for evolutionary theory. And it's interesting he brought up horses as one example. Why don't we start there? In 1924, the Doheny Scientific Expedition ventured into the Havasupai Canyon region of Grand Canyon. The expedition report, penned by Samuel Hubbard, is a short and fascinating read. Now, this short expedition brought multiple enigmas to the attention of the scientific community. One discovery of fossil footprints was only briefly mentioned in the report, saying that Mr. Gilmore was at a loss to explain these carboniferous footprints. That Mr. Gilmore was Charles W. Gilmore, who gave more detail in a 1926 issue of the Smithsonian Miscellaneous Collections. Mr. Gilmore showed the footprints which bore the clear resemblance of horse footprints. The local native Indians considered them to be the tracks of a band of horses. Now, you need to remember, the Indians were, by nature of their lifestyle, excellent trackers. They can well identify an animal by its footprints, as their hunt depended on it. I would think they would know what a horse footprint looked like. But the problem was that these footprints were out of place. They were in Carboniferous or Permian rocks. In either case, the rocks were far too old, according to evolutionary theory. After all, I'm sure most of you have seen the alleged evolution of the horse. Though this sequence was shown wrong many years ago, it still appears in many natural history museums and textbooks. But notice the dates. The ancestor to the horse was first supposed to have arisen 50 million years ago. Now, these fossil footprints in Grand Canyon, identical to those of the modern horse, were in rocks dated by evolutionists pushing 300 million years old. Not only is the horse sequence topsy-turvy, it puts the modern horse way down here on the geologic timescale. Mr. Gilmore attempted to explain away the footprints as not even fossil footprints, but simply stains in the rock, perhaps caused by marine organisms. But decades later, the famous E.D. McKee visited the footprints and called them such, fossil footprints. However, he just simply labeled them as from an unknown quadrupedal animal, or an animal with 4 legs. Now, one must ask the question, why would these very smart people struggle to identify whether or not these were even fossil footprints? And then struggle with the identification of the animal that made them, especially when the identity was glaringly obvious. Evolutionary theory does not permit the glaringly obvious conclusion, ruling out possibilities and discoveries before they are even made. But it gets better. The Doheny expedition also documented a fascinating petroglyph of what they even labeled as a dinosaur. Now, as I mentioned in Crevo Rant number 100, the dating game has been played since before Darwin's time. In fact, the dating game was what inspired Darwin in his evolutionary thinking. Now, as we go through time, you'll notice that the scientific ages and what we know has changed. Hubbard commented that a photograph of this dinosaur petroglyph had been shown to a scientist of report, who then remarked, "It is not a dinosaur. It is impossible because we know that dinosaurs were extinct 12 million years before man appeared on Earth." Notice that today, those claiming to be of report in the scientific community would say that we know the dinosaurs became extinct 60 million years before humans evolved. Their ages get longer while still ignoring the copious amounts of evidence, like the dozens of examples of dinosaurs in ancient artwork we find all over the world. Vance Nelson's Dire Dragons was devoted just to the subject of dinosaurs in ancient art, and provides numerous examples. Hubbard, who was certainly no creationist and actually bemoaned being hurled into the creation-evolution debate by his discovery of the dinosaur petroglyph, bravely pointed out what we would deduce from the dinosaur petroglyph. The fact that some prehistoric man made a pictograph of a dinosaur on the walls of this canyon upsets completely all of our theories regarding the antiquity of man. Facts are stubborn and immutable things. If theories do not square with the facts, then the theories must change. The facts remain. In Tai Prom, Cambodia is a temple dedicated in 1186 AD, so it's just a little over 800 years old. Now, as you go through the temple, you'll notice ornate carvings on the pillars. As you get closer, you start to recognize some of the creatures. Here's a monkey, a deer, a water buffalo, and then there's this strange creature. While it has strange features on its head, even children immediately recognize the carving as a stegosaur. The plates going down its back are a dead giveaway. In what can only be described as astonishingly desperate lunacy, the Smithsonian published an article claiming that perhaps this was a modern sculpture put there by a movie crew. Really? Well, first of all, there is obvious patina in the grooves of the carving. Patina takes hundreds of years to grow. How their supposed experts could miss this is beyond me. But then again, there are none so blind as those who will not see. Secondly, do you honestly think a movie crew would get away with altering an ancient landmark of national pride, such as Tai Prom? Look, I struggle to be respectful with the words that come to mind to describe such a ridiculous assertion as that put forward by the Smithsonian. Stegosaurus fossils have never been found in Cambodia. In fact, Stegosaurus fossils have only been found on the other side of the planet, in North America. And now, as of 2007, some were found in Western Europe. Furthermore, as anybody who knows anything about fossil dinosaurs, you almost never find the entire dinosaur. You'll find a jumble of ripped apart bones here and probably never find anything else. Even when you do find a relatively complete skeleton, it is usually ripped to pieces, and some interpretation is required to piece it back together. That interpretation is usually accomplished by finding parts that are still joined together here and there. In other words, almost invariably, you must find and excavate many separate dinosaur skeletons. Now, this is why Sue the T-Rex was so valuable. The skeleton was astonishingly complete. Now, when you see a dinosaur skeleton in a museum, almost invariably what you are looking at is a composite of multiple skeletons, found at multiple locations. In fact, often many of those bones are sculpted, handmade and scaled up from bones that were found from a different size of that same kind of dinosaur. To find and excavate any dinosaur bones requires an enormous amount of work. To find enough bones to make an identifiable skeleton requires exponentially more work and excavation. For example, the iguanodon, as it was originally constructed and originally described, was radically different from what we know now, after many more skeletons were found and studied by many people over many years. Now, I have been involved in the process of finding, excavating, preparing, molding, and casting dinosaur bones from beginning to end. It's thousands of man-hours involved, large, dedicated facilities, many people. Today, the Modern Day Museum is where this all typically takes place. But to give you an idea of just how big a job it is, this plastered jacket of dinosaur bone, still in the rock matrix at a dig site in northern Colorado, was being excavated by Joe Taylor of Mount Blanco Fossil Museum and the Creation Evidence Museum, both of Texas. That lump of rock may contain a dozen or so bones and weighs upwards around 500 pounds. Now, a few hundred years from now, archaeologists searching out the remains of our now dead culture would find the remains of our fossil excavation and preparation facilities. This is because the process is so involved and requires such large facilities of so many people. So when we are talking about legends and artwork depicting dinosaurs, remember, we're talking about all kinds of different cultures. Ancient Europe, ancient Babylon, tribal cultures in the Amazon rainforest, the Hopi Indians of North America. If these cultures were excavating dinosaurs, we would find archaeological evidence of such. We find no such archaeological evidence or historical evidence in any of these cultures. Further to that, both the verbal and artistic depictions of these dinosaurs refer to details such as skin. It is only after a century and a half of studies from around the world, millions of man-hours of research, millions of tons of technical equipment, and thousands of fossil dinosaur remains that we are able to say what little we can about dinosaur skin. Because fossil dinosaur skin is exceedingly rare. It's big news if dinosaur skin impressions or actual fossilized skin is found, because it is so rare. So how did the ancients provide such details of identifiable dinosaurs, including specific details about their skin and colors? Well, the simplest, most logical explanation for all of this is that the ancient peoples saw living dinosaurs. Now, why is that so hard to believe? Live Science had an interesting article on dragons and dragon legends this past week. It was interesting to see the admissions by a secular news reporting agency in this article, the admission that dragon legends are prolific in pretty much every single culture in the world, and the admission that far too many of these legends bear a non-mythological realism to them, as well as a resemblance to dinosaurs. Author Benjamin Radford starts off by acknowledging how prolific dragons are in so many cultures, literally all over the world. He then states that nobody knows how, where, or why the stories of dragons first emerged. The question then arises, just what is a dragon? Even the Bible mentions dragons, so just what is a dragon? Now, we all have this culturally instilled picture of what a dragon supposedly looks like, But the typical dragon we think of is a mythologized chimera. That is, it's a combination of all the different types of dragons, blended into one which has been exaggerated in typical mythology fashion. When one looks at the specific descriptions of specific dragons, several things come to light. And I agree with Radford when he quotes the book of Job in the Bible. The behemoth and leviathan described in chapters 40 and 41 would be dragons of some sort, but also could be dinosaurs. Now, the name dinosaur was coined by Sir Richard Owen in 1841. English translations of the Bible were written before this word was invented, which is why you do not see the word dinosaur in the Bible. Now, Richard Owen was the founder of what is now the British Museum of Natural History. Now, before the term dinosaur became commonplace, and in fact for quite a while afterwards, the dinosaurs were called dragons. You can still see some of the historic fossils in the British Museum with dragon written on the stone slab. As Radford even acknowledges, the dragon legends and descriptions are so specific, so prolific, that the link between dragons and dinosaurs is too specific to be ignored. Entire books have been written on the subject, documenting the depictions of dinosaurs in ancient artwork, such as David Wetzel's Chronicles of Dinosauria, and Vance Nelson's book of dozens of new examples, Dire Dragons. Another example which Vance shared on this show was a native pictograph in the Amazon jungle. Only one example of many from around the world, in still yet another isolated culture, which depicts what is clearly a large sauropod-like creature being hunted in the typical fashion by the tribesmen. Vance hopes to get a booklet out in April documenting this one specific fantastic find. But even descriptions from historical accounts are too specific and quite believable. Both Herodotus and Aristotle spoke of small flying reptiles in Egypt, Arabia, and Ethiopia. They described them as small in size and of various colors, with a snake-like body and bat-like wings. Flocks of them would gather in frankincense trees, and when the workers wanted to harvest the trees, they would use smelly smoke to make the reptiles leave, much like a beekeeper uses smoke to keep bees at bay when working on a hive. In 1572, a farmer in northern Italy was going along with his oxen, which were startled by a strange baby lizard. The farmer killed the creature by smacking it on the head with his walking stick. Ulysses Aldrovandus obtained the body of the dragon, drew it, and had it mounted in a museum. Aldrovandus concluded it was a baby because of its incompletely developed claws and teeth. Now, while strange looking, if we were to find this creature in fossil form, there is no doubt we would call it a type of dinosaur. In the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle of 1405, we find a story of a strange and dangerous creature. Close to the town of Burrs, near Sudbury, there has lately appeared to the great herd of the countryside a dragon, vast in body with a crested head, teeth like a saw, and a tail extending to an enormous length. Having slaughtered the shepherd of the flock, it devoured many sheep. In order to destroy him, all the country people around were summoned. But when the dragon saw that he was again to be assailed with arrows, he fled into a marsh or mere and there hid himself among the long reeds and was no more seen. The description of this dragon is very believable. But it's not just the missing time. We have literally hundreds, and throughout North America, I've now gotten to study 7 of these locations out of hundreds, what geologists call overthrusts. Now, my question is it really an overthrust? What they're saying...
Now, what is an overthrust, first of all?
Yeah, this is where you have, for instance, a rock layer that might be 300 million years old sitting on top of a rock layer that's supposed to be 100 million years old.
Right.
They're reversed.
Okay.
Yeah, there's backwards. And so what the geologists have done to attempt to explain this is they claim it's an overthrust, where the 300 million year old rock slid up over top of the 100 million year old rock. That's the claim. Now, I'm not opposed to the idea of there being an overthrust. We see incredible tectonic activity around the world. Why not, right?
Yes.
So what I did was I went and investigated several different locations. There was one in Arizona just south of Tucson. There was 2 locations in Nevada just outside of Las Vegas. One was a Valley of Fire. This is what's called the Keystone Overthrust. It's a very famous overthrust. And Red Rock Canyon.
I've been there. Yeah.
There was also 4 that I investigated up in Alberta and BC, and some of these are just brutal to get to. Oh wow!
you had to take the
climbing
sneakers
up
to those, huh?
Oh yeah, you got to be determined because it was about a 4-hour hike ascending about 5,000 feet in Banff to get to the one, and the last section I really wasn't sure I was going to make it, but I made it barely. But
Well,
basically,
tell us what you found there. What was it that you discovered?
Okay, well, what do you find when you get there? If the rock layer slid up over top of the other, well, the first thing you'd expect to see is scratch marks, right?
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, if the rock slid over top of the other, you'd expect scratch marks. And geologists call these slicken sides. There's actually a technical name for them. What I discovered was there was no slicken sides anywhere at any of the 7 locations I went to.
No
Not
slicken
a
slides.
one. None whatsoever. Another feature you would see from the rocks sliding over top of one another is the actual balling and rolling of the rocks, leaving myelinite, which looks like this. Yamnuska Mountain was only one of 7 different thrust faults that I had the privilege to study over the past few years. Now, it's a brutal hike, but you can go up that mountain and take a look for yourself. Now, here we are getting up to what we call the contact, where the limestone and the shale meet. Now, as we get right at the contact, we see no evidence that the rock is even discolored from heat, let alone melted. There is no myelinite visible. Now, some suggest that perhaps the rock could have slid very slowly over top the others, so as to not produce heat. But that doesn't work. This is basic physics. Have you ever pushed something heavy across the floor? Getting it started is the hard part. Keeping it moving is quite a bit easier. The reason for this is because static or standing friction is greater than the friction of movement. In other words, it takes more force to start something moving from a standstill than it does to keep it moving. So if we apply this principle to our 1,000-foot thick slab of rock, if there was some kind of force that was pushing on the rock enough to start it moving, then that same force would suddenly move the rock in jumps, because once it starts moving, it has an excess of force to move the rock. You cannot move the rock slowly, plain and simple. But when rock slides across another rock, it leaves scratches, which geologists call slicken sides. Now, if you look closely at this picture of a polystrate fossil tree in Tennessee, what is hard to see is that the tree is actually bent over in the rocks at this overhang. But obviously the rocks did not slide very far relative to each other. I mean, there's a fossil tree connecting the layers. Yet, though they are hard to see in this photo, slicken sides were made from that little bit of movement. Now let's take a look at the overhang at the contact of the Yamnuska Mountain. Notice no slicken sides. In fact, there was some minor interbedding of the shales and limestone, indicating they were formed at the same time. Are we to believe that a 1,000-foot thick layer of rock slid several kilometers over top the other one without even so much as scratching the rocks? Secondly, when you do the math, up in Banff, for example, the Castle Mountain overthrust and the Yamnuska Mountain overthrust, you're talking 1,000 feet of limestone and 2,000 feet of limestone in these formations that allegedly slid over top of the other. Well, when you do the math in physics, that is so much friction and heat, it would melt the rock.
Wow.
Forget about scratching it. It would melt it. And there's no evidence of heat. No evidence of, the only evidence of metamorphosis is local, which is where the rocks have actually shifted vertically relative to each other.
Right.
In other words, there was no evidence that these rocks slid over top of the other. That's what I found. Now, taking a hike up there and getting to the contact, it is actually difficult to discern where the two rocks meet. That's how knife edge the contact is. No evidence of melting or even heating of the rock. No myelinite. So are we expected to believe that 2,000 feet of solid rock was shoved up several kilometers over top the other with no evidence whatsoever that this happened? Such an event would most definitely have melted the rock. But let's head down to Waterton Lakes National Park in Canada, which joins onto Glacier National Park in the US. Now here we see another alleged thrust fault called the Lewis thrust. And the ages assigned to the rocks, it depends on who you ask, but typically it's described as 1.1 billion year old rocks resting on top of allegedly 100 million year old rocks. Now while I went there personally to examine the contact, you'll notice that not only are there no slick insides or evidence of extreme heating, the rocks themselves of the Waterton side are folded in unison, even with minor interbedding and interfingering between the layers. There is no myelinite here. In fact, the pro-evolution anti-creation website, Talk Origins, even inadvertently admits that the slick insides are absent by saying that some of the rocks have slick insides. Well, yes, undoubtedly there are slick insides in some areas, though I saw none where Vance Nelson and I studied. But that just indicates a very localized movement from all the mountain folding and whatnot. All of the contacts should have prominent slick insides, extreme heating and even melting of the rocks, and myelinite. Had they actually slid across each other for the 100 kilometers or so that is suggested? Now look, I'm certainly open to the idea of a thrust fault, but I want to see the evidence of such a sliding event. Of the 7 thrust faults I have had the privilege of studying, only one sorta kinda had evidence that may be interpreted as sliding. And yet other areas of the same fault showed zero evidence of sliding. Now, what we have here are layers that are out of sequence, evolutionarily speaking. There are hundreds of these in North America alone. I've only studied 7 thus far. If only one was a genuine reversal, it would invalidate the geologic column and, ultimately, evolutionary theory. So far, out of 7, I've determined at least 6 of them are genuine, out-of-sequence layers, with no evidence of thrust faulting. And that lack of evidence has been noted even in the secular literature. These are not thrust faults. They are invalidations of the fictitious geologic column and deep time.
Now, not only that, they also find polystrata fossils, correct?
Yes.
And those are actually fossils that are running up through several layers of sediment.
Yes.
And are those found all over North America?
All over the world.
All over the world.
As for Derek Ager's comments about the catastrophes interspersed with long periods of time, I thought Chris Carlecchio did a great job dismantling that idea. Sometimes geologists don't know the difference. Derek Ager said that the rate of deposition for siliceous ooze was as little as 0.05 grams per square centimeter per 1,000 years in the tropics to as high as 50 grams per square centimeter in the Gulf of California. The polystrate tree through siliceous deposits shows that he was wrong. That's the point. They're people, and like anyone else, they make mistakes.
Hey, some of you guys have questions. There is about this subject of the geologic column. One of the books that started the entire creation movement was called The Genesis Flood by Henry Morris, the late Henry Morris. Started the modern creation movement. Well, it has now been remastered, as for rewritten, and a lot of the same material.
Yeah. Well, this one is not rewritten. This one is the original, but it's in a new edition, the 50th anniversary edition by Henry Morris and John Whitcomb. And I've got an anecdote which I think I've shared before. It takes a bit of time, but it's about getting my copy signed. We've also got Earth's Catastrophic Past, which is the rewrite of the Genesis Flood by Dr. Andrew Snelling of Answers in Genesis. And published by ICR, and this is a marvelous book.
It is. It's a two-volume book that is really good. And if you're interested in studying more about the strata, the catastrophe, the obvious flood that took place, You really ought to check out some of those.
So back in the 1930s, an unusual report of fossil human footprints surfaced. These fossil human footprints were in Carboniferous rock near Berea, Kentucky, and were examined by Dr. Burroughs, who founded the geology department at Berea College. Creationists had talked about these tracks for many years, and I had managed to obtain a copy of the reference, a Scientific American paper from January of 1940. I took one look at the pictures and said, nope, those are carvings, not fossil tracks. Now, it turns out I wasn't the only one who did this. Talk Origins and Glenn Kubin both show these photos on their website. Back Archaeology refers to the Siam article, and Institute for Biblical and Scientific Studies also refers to the Siam article in mocking disdain towards the creationary claim of fossil human footprints in Carboniferous rocks. In fact, the Scientific American article is the source of the quote that so many a creationist has cited. If man, or even his ape ancestor, or even that ape ancestor's early mammalian ancestor, existed as far back as the Carboniferous period in any shape, then the whole science of geology is so wrong that all the geologists will resign their jobs and take up truck driving. Hence, for the present at least, science rejects the attractive explanation that man made these mysterious prints in the mud of the Carboniferous period with his feet. David Willis of Indianapolis had contacted myself as he wanted to go investigate the Berea tracks, as well as an alleged fossil human footprint that had recently come to light in Tennessee. I was in Ohio at the time, so we ventured down together. We spent the day in the archives at Berea College and found a copy of the Siam article in Professor Burroughs' archives, and thus got our first shock of the day. The photographs presented in the Siam article were not the Berean fossil footprints. In fact, if you read Ingalls' article carefully, you can read between the lines and note that he never did say the tracks pictured were the Berean tracks, though the Berean tracks were the focus of discussion in the article. Ingalls' article can only be described as scandalous, but the scandal didn't stop there. A second article published by the Christian Science Monitor showed two photographs, neither of which were photographs of the Berean fossil human footprints. The upper photograph was a pencil rubbing of a pair of the Berean footprints, which the Monitor claimed was oily stains left over from the molding of the tracks, and the lower photograph was fossil amphibian tracks from some unknown location. Burroughs himself noted in his personal correspondence that the Monitor even went to the trouble of displaying only 10 tracks in the amphibian ichthofossil slab, which just happened to match the number of prints found at the Berean site. Now, it's being gracious to chalk all of this up to bad journalism. A more accurate description would probably be fraudulent, deliberately misleading reporting. So just what was the evidence then? Why is it that although both Scientific American and the Christian Science Monitor had access to photographs of the actual fossil footprints at Berea, they instead showed photographs of what were obviously Indian carvings and amphibian fossil footprints? Why did both Siam and the Monitor both then interview experts and get their opinions on the photographs of Indian carvings and fossil footprints that were not the Berean fossil footprints? David and I both obtained wax castings of the original fossil footprints, as the originals had all been cut out of the rock. Now, much to my surprise, they were genuine fossil human footprints. There is clear displaced mud surrounding the footprints, and multiple researchers noted the increased density in the sand grains surrounding the footprints, verifying that they were genuine footprints. The footprints are clearly human, as there is no creature, fossil or living, that makes a footprint like a human. And there is no doubt the rock is assigned the evolutionary age of 250 million years old. I will be detailing the Berean fossil footprints in the current issue of Core Ottawa's Crevo News, which should be coming out any day now, and you can sign up for that newsletter right here. But if there's copious examples of dinosaurs in ancient artwork, because humans and dinosaurs did live at the same time, then why don't we find their fossil bones mixed together? Well, excellent question, but how often do we find human bones mixed together with the bones of dead moose? Or the bones of dead bears? Lions? We all live contemporaneously. Furthermore, there are numerous examples of creatures still alive today that are absent from the fossil record completely, like the coelacanth, for example, which is still alive today, but whose fossils are completely missing from the last alleged 70 million years of rock record. Absence of fossils does not mean the creature was not there. Furthermore, there has been evidence of man and dinosaur living at the same time. It's been ignored and mocked. In Glen Rose, Texas, the famous Paluxy River has eroded away rocks revealing copious numbers of fossil dinosaur tracks. In amongst all those dinosaur tracks are hundreds of fossil human footprints. Sometimes the human tracks are beside the dinosaur tracks. Sometimes they are inside them. Sometimes the dinosaur stepped on a human footprint. The human footprints often have clear toe impressions, mud that was squished up by the foot and has now hardened into rock, just like the rest of the fossil. Spiral CAT scans have verified the compression in the rock, showing that the footprints are indeed authentic and not carved, though the majority of the human footprints were actually excavated from underneath solid rock in the presence of multiple eyewitnesses. I document the CAT scans in the video The Dulk Track, Evidence of Dinosaur and Human Coexistence, which is archived on YouTube. You can watch that video by going to genesisweek.com and looking through the video archives. The Taylor Trail. The Taylor Trail is probably the most famous of the trails of fossil human footprints in the Paluxy, and the evidence that most people cite as proof that the human footprints are not human footprints. The Taylor Trail is a series of 14 dinosaur footprints in a right-left-right pattern. The Taylor Trail is a series of 14 tracks where evidently a dinosaur walked in the mud. Shortly thereafter, before the mud hardened into rock, a human then stepped in the footprints of the dinosaur. Now this makes sense for multiple reasons. Energy conservation, for instance. It is easier to walk in packed mud than it is to walk in sloppy mud. So both humans and animals are often seen to walk in the tracks of others, in snow or mud. It was suggested by multiple people that the dinosaur tracks were simply dinosaurs walking on their heels, what is called plantigrade, instead of walking on their toes like normal, called digitigrade. The dinosaur tracks then produced a vaguely human-looking footprint inside of their track. Well, there's a few problems with that theory. Namely, the dinosaur was evidently walking on a dislocated heel, as the alleged heel impression, which I would say was the footprints of a separate creature, changes position within the tracks as you go down the trail. Sometimes the footprint was right up into the toe impression of the track, a neat trick to walk on your heel, which is on top of your toe. Eventually, the dinosaur was apparently having a really bad day as its heel fell off and made its own trail, landing in the left toe of another dinosaur track going in the opposite direction. And, oh, by the way, that is the only track in that entire trail that has a human footprint-shaped depression in it. Toe impressions are visible in the human footprint, and the human toes are in the heel of the dinosaur footprint, while the heel of the human footprint is in the left toe of the dinosaur track. Several of the human footprints in the trail reveal distinct toe impressions, including the spectacular -3B, which has indents from all 5 toes preserved: the ball, the arch, and the heel. Furthermore, the upper Taylor Trail, which is further upstream in the Paluxy River and is probably a continuation of the human trail from the Taylor Trail, gives us further indication that the human footprints in dinosaur tracks are completely separate entities. For example, the number 4 human footprint overlaps a dinosaur track. First of all, notice that the other dinosaur tracks do not have any indication of a human-like depression. Secondly, notice what has happened to the number 4 human footprint and the dinosaur track it stepped upon. Over the years, differential erosion has raised the dinosaur track while eroding the human footprint. Now, what is differential erosion? If you have 2 different rocks exposed to the elements, say in a riverbed, one rock is harder than the other. Well, the softer rock will be eroded away quickly, while the harder rock gets eroded slowly. They erode differently. Differential erosion. And so we can see in this immediate area that many of the dinosaur tracks have actually become raised in the riverbed because of differential erosion. Where the dinosaurs stepped made the rock harder than the surrounding rock, so the river has eroded away the rock in the riverbed, but the dinosaur track itself erodes more slowly, and so it becomes raised from the riverbed over time. Well, the number 4 human footprint has eroded faster than the riverbed, while the dinosaur track became raised. These are very clearly not the same footprint. In other words, it is not an elongated dinosaur track. If they were one and the same track, they would erode in unison. In fact, the human footprint has spectacularly preserved impressions from all 5 toes. The fact that they erode differently, the fact that other dinosaur tracks in the same trail show none of these impressions, the fact that the human footprint was part of a trail, all speak loudly that these are genuine fossil human footprints, alongside and in fossil dinosaur tracks. Sometimes the human tracks were, fortunately, removed from the riverbed before laws against such action were invoked, and thus the tracks are preserved in spectacular condition. One such track is the Willett track. Now, we have the testimony of O.W. Willett, who removed this single track from a trail of footprints exposed by a flash flood in the 1950s. The hole from the removed rock is still visible today on the park ledge, and even after some 60 years of erosion, the tracks leading up to and away from the hole are still visible today. At least one of them still has visible toe impressions. But the Willett track itself is clearly a human footprint. Now, sometimes loose tracks are brought to light, which could be carvings. So Dr. Baugh had the brainstorm to use spiral CAT scans to examine the tracks. A spiral CAT scan is basically a 3-dimensional X-ray. Now, as you've all seen X-rays, the denser an object is, the whiter it is on the image. Muscles basically do not show up at all, while bones show up bright white. Now, using CT scans, we can examine these density variations inside the rock of the tracks. If the track is genuine, we can see that the foot compressed the mud in areas, which then hardened into rock, like we see here under the toes of the Delk track. You can see immediately under the toes it is more white, showing higher density. In contrast, this is a track which we know was carved by a local Glenrose resident, Bull Adams. Notice the lack of higher density rock under the toes of the track. So we have a genuine fossil human footprints scattered throughout the dinosaur tracks in Glenrose, Texas, which, by the way, is not the only place this has been found, but rather it is simply the most famous. Dr. Aaron Judkins wrote in regarding last week's show. Regarding the Paluxy footprints, I stand by Ian's assertion, and I mean that literally. I have researched the Paluxy for over 15 years, personally excavating alongside Ian on numerous occasions. Part of my research includes the photo of the +6 in the Taylor Trail that empirically shows its authenticity. Indeed, they are real. Remember, human fossil footprints are not isolated to the Glenrose area. It is a global phenomena, which I documented in my book, Evolution in Human Fossil Footprints. Peter Bilmer also wrote in on Facebook, apropos science educators or people who pretend to be one. A creepy YouTube atheist claims that a geological formation known as the Ashley Phosphate Beds is composed of invisible layers proving deep time. Can you address that claim? Is that because every evidence for evolutionism is in fact invisible and has to be imagined? Well, thanks for writing in, Peter. The Ashley Phosphate Beds are a layer of sediments which are being mined today for its high quantities of phosphate, which is being used for fertilizer. These sedimentary layers are huge, covering large portions of the Carolinas and quite probably extending into Florida and up into Canada. The world-famous geologist Louis Agassiz described the phosphate beds as the greatest graveyard he had ever known. The phosphate beds have so many fossil bones in them that it's believed the phosphate itself is from bones. So, if the Ashley phosphate beds are so loaded with such incredible fossils as to cause one of the leading geologists and zoologists of his day to call them the greatest graveyard he had ever known, Why then has virtually zero been written about the fossils in the scientific literature? When you look at what was written in the 1800s, you'll probably quickly deduce why. The fossils completely ravage the evolutionary timeline. In that 18-inch thick layer, there has been found together the bones of whales, porpoises, fish, sharks and ray sharks, including the gigantic shark Megalodon, toads, crocodiles, alligators, turtles, rabbits, monkeys, horses, tapirs, camels, elephants, rhinoceroses, mammoths and mastodons, sloths, muskrats, deer, pigs, dogs, sheep, hadrosaur dinosaurs, iguanodon dinosaurs, what are commonly called marine dinosaurs like the plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs, and yes, human bones, teeth, and artifacts. That's right, dinosaurs, mammoths, marine reptiles from the alleged dinosaur period, and humans, all found in the same layer. As many leading evolutionists have acknowledged, if humans and dinosaurs were found together, it would demonstrate that the Earth was young. It would refute the millions of years and would refute evolution. Creation would be vindicated. So how does this atheist answer this powerful evidence, refuting evolution and affirming a young Earth and creation? By claiming that there are layers to the Ashley phosphate beds, and that the marine dinosaurs, the mammoths, and the human fossils are actually separated into these individual layers. You just can't see the layers. Invisible layers. Good explanation. This bizarre explanation gets even weirder when you consider the layer average is a whopping 18 inches thick. That's a lot of invisible layers compressed into 1.5 feet of sediments. And this would also mean that the scientists who have studied it were completely blind to these layers, which is ridiculous, seeing as how they'd studied layers elsewhere, and this layer was only 18 inches thick. Professor of Geology and Paleontology, F.S. Holmes, believed in the conventional evolutionary sequence, so he knew full well that humans and dinosaurs should not be found in the same layer. In fact, he wrote, "Not long after finding the above-named relics of human workmanship, and engaged in our usual visits to the Ashley bed, a bone was found projecting from the bluff, immediately in contact with the surface of the stony stratum, the phosphate rocks. We pulled it out, and behold, a human bone. Without hesitation, it was condemned as an accidental occupant of quarters to which it had no right, geologically, and so we threw it into the river. Alas, we have lived to regret our temerity and rashness. A year after, a lower jawbone with teeth was taken from the same bed, and now we have it in the cabinet." In fact, Holmes even portrayed a dinosaur and a human on the cover of his book. The only people claiming invisible layers is creepy internet atheists. Others, like Holmes, have at least tried to explain the way the fossils found together as perhaps fossils that were worked out of older and younger rocks to be washed together. Now, this theory also just plain doesn't work, and I don't have time to get into explaining that today, but it shows you that these experts who spent considerable time excavating in the phosphate beds obviously didn't think there was multiple layers there, contrary to the ignoramuses on YouTube, who obviously don't even know how to use Google to find basic information about the Ashley phosphate beds. You can read more on the Ashley phosphate beds in the book written by the late geologist John Watson, Man, Dinosaurs, and Mammals Together, available at the Mount Blanco Fossil Museum. Thanks for writing in, Peter. Over in the United States, 10 completely modern fossil human skeletons were found in incredibly hard sandstone. The sandstone was slowly removed over decades as part of mining operations, and in fact it was the extreme hardness of the rock that led to the closing of the mine. One day the bulldozer struck the first human bones that would be found. The operator, who had been working there for many years, estimated he had removed some 50 feet or 15 meters of solid, hard sandstone by the time he had gotten down to the level of the skeletons. The skeletons had been stained blue and green by the minerals in the rock. 10 skeletons of men, women, and children were found. But here's the catch. The skeletons were entombed in the Dakota sandstone, which, according to the U.S. Geological Survey, is 100 million years old. Well, that's the time of the dinosaurs. So the anti-creationists sprung into action to explain away this very out-of-place series of fossils with their usual ridiculous theories, trying to defend their religion from scrutiny. Ridiculous theory number 1, they must be Indian burials. Really? When was the last time you saw Indians digging through 50 feet of solid rock in order to bury their dead? And somehow leaving no evidence of digging. Ridiculous theory number 2. They must have fallen down a crack or a crevice in the rock. Really? Do you not think the bulldozer operator who excavated that rock for decades would have noticed a crack that big? Ridiculous theory number 3. There were Indians mining for copper and the concretions found in the rocks that are a beautiful blue, much like a blue marble. Then the mine collapsed. Really? And what were women and children doing in there? And where's the evidence of this tunnel? The skeletons were entombed in solid rock, not a collapsed cave or tunnel. The most obvious and simple explanation for the skeletons is that they were buried in the rock when the rock was formed. If that most obvious and simple explanation destroys the theory of evolution because that puts the skeletons underneath dinosaur skeletons in another formation, well, that's not my problem, because I have found that this is just more evidence that the biblical account of creation is correct and the evolutionism myth is once again proven wrong. But we also find multiple human artifacts in rocks allegedly too old. For instance, Max Hahn and his family were fishing at a waterfall near London, Texas in 1936. He found a rock sitting on a ledge with a piece of wood sticking out of it. He took the curiosity home and broke open the rock to discover the wood was actually the handle of a fossil hammer. Named the London artifact, geologist John Watson was able to nail down the source rock several miles upstream from the location. Rock which dates to the Cretaceous, or the age of the dinosaurs, according to evolutionism. Yes, of course, the anti-creationists came up with their ridiculous theories, of which I discuss in quite a bit of detail in my special report on my blog here. The anti-creationist stories fail in every respect to explain away this hammer. The most simple and obvious explanation is that the hammer was buried in the Cretaceous rocks when the rocks were formed and was eroded out of the cliffs along with a pile of other rock. Frank Kennard was working at the Municipal Electric Plant in Thomas, Oklahoma in 1912. While working with the coal for the coal-fired plant, he had a lump of coal which was too large for the furnace, so he did what they always did. He hit it with a sledgehammer. In front of a second eyewitness, they watched in amazement as an iron pot fell out of the middle of the lump of coal. Kennard traced the coal back to the Wilburton coal mines of Oklahoma, dated by the U.S. Geological Survey as 295 million years old. According to the evolutionism myth, that is before the time of the dinosaurs. This also doesn't acknowledge the fossil footprints found in Grand Canyon by geologist John Mackay and published some 20 years ago. Footprints in rocks dated by evolutionists as 115 million years before Tiktaalik. These were clear tetrapod footprints, complete with toes. Well, if the Bible is right about the original creation, what does it say about the end of creation? It says that this creation has become corrupted by our sin. Death, disease, sickness, and suffering has entered into this world because of our sin, our disobedience to our Creator. He is going to make a new heaven and a new earth, but cannot allow even one drop of sin to enter into that new heaven and new earth. But that's a problem, because we have all sinned. That is why Jesus, our Creator, created a body in which to live a sinless life and then pay the price of sin, which is death, in our place. He said to enter into eternity, you must be born again. Why don't you give him your life today?